All right, gang. Let's focus up. And Laurie, whenever you're ready.
All right. Well, guys, we are going to talk today about how we can practically walk alongside our LGBT friends and family, or, maybe ourselves if we are wrestling with this. So we're going to take 6 steps to journey well alongside our LGBT friends. And at the end, we're going to be doing some Q&A. So I want to hear from you all. So what is the first step? The first one, in my opinion, is to really see that there's brokenness everywhere. It's really easy for us to go they, them, but how about us? And what is some of our brokenness, specifically when it comes to sexuality and gender even? But pornography, it's so interesting to me that this has become literally every man's battle, and at some level, every woman's battle is like, oh yes, well, when was your pornography wrestling? When really it's lust, and Jesus equates it with adultery. And so I don't say that to shame, I just say, we can roll our eyes at these numbers, but it isn't insignificant that 57% of pastors and 64% of youth pastors currently have struggled with pornography. And these are leaders. This isn't to shame. This is just to state a fact. Like, this is reality. 65% of young men and 47% of older men. So this is believers or not. Seek out porn regularly, and 33% of young women and 12% of older women seek it out regularly. And so this is a current issue in our world. Additionally, teens and young adults view not recycling as more immoral than viewing porn, which, again, this is a violation of our minds, our souls, and our bodies, and God equates it with adultery. And additionally, 87% of Christian single people believe it's okay to have sex before marriage, and that same 87% of Christian single people believe it's okay to live with someone before marriage. And so, again, before we start doing they, them, we need to point this finger back at our own self. And this one's a little just kind of funny, but it is just reality that 84% of wives have sex to have their husbands do more housework. So I throw that in this. My husband will say, if we were speaking together, he'd be like, yeah, and probably 84% of men, do housework to get more sex. But anyway, which we can laugh at this, but like when you actually look at, if you think about, what I was talking about the metaphor of marriage, and really we didn't talk about the metaphor of sex in marriage, which is it's a gospel metaphor in a gospel metaphor. Because in sex, we say to this person, if God has called us to marriage, we say, God wants to be holistically one with you. He wants no space. He wants not just your body, he wants your mind, he wants your soul, he wants your spirit. And so it's a physical representation of that. And so that's a holy thing, really, as opposed to a filmed thing, or as opposed to currency for housework. So I throw that in this, just because it's in the confines of God's design for marriage doesn't mean it's godly. Additionally, so here now we're kind of maybe stepping out of the traditionally heterosexual sins, which also these can be under LGBT, but polyamory is growing, which is, love, sexual love between more than 2 partners. And 5% of Americans are currently in a consensual non-monogamous relationship. 20% of Americans have been in a non-monogamous relationship, so like consensual, it's not just like you're cheating. And 24% of church-going people think it's morally permissible to be in a non-monogamous relationship. What the what? So, and we actually did a Hole in My Heart podcast. We did an episode on but when you look at David, you look at Solomon, Solomon's a bad example, but if you look at Abraham, they have these wives, and do you guys know how to argue for one man and one woman marriage? If you focus on the singularity. So I think maybe this is where we get this number from, is you're like, I don't know, they were good dudes, and sure, it's fine. Okay, but there is more brokenness, and now we're just saying these statistics just so we kind of know what are we dealing with, what's kind of going on in our world. 20% of millennials, that's born between 81 and 96, and likely Gen Z, and I say likely because we don't have the statistics quite yet nailed down on them, they're still young, identify as LGBTQIA. 12% of Gen X do, and 7% of boomers And so this is a pretty, I don't know, it's a pretty high numbers to me. I remember when I was younger, like the 10% number would get contested. Like, oh no, it's 1 or 2%. Transgender, so people who have diagnosable gender dysphoria. So this is where you feel your biological sex and who you are as male or female, there's a disconnect. So people who've been diagnosed with that, which, just FYI, the diagnosis, as far as seeing it, putting it into the DSM for counselors, so saying like that this is not okay, that's going to get removed soon. And so that dissonance is going to be dubbed as okay. So again, I'm not really making a statement on it. I'm just saying this is what we're dealing with here. 70% of Gen Z, so those would be kids in college through like, I believe it's like elementary-ish, believe it's okay to identify differently than your biological sex. Those numbers might even be higher. This was 2 years ago, 2018. And there's been a 4,000% increase in the UK of youth desiring a sex change. They've seen a 4,000% increase in people wanting this. In California, people who identify as non-binary, it's 27% of teens. Okay, so now we're just kind of getting a sense of the landscape. We got brokenness in the church, we got brokenness in our homes, we do have brokenness when it comes to LGBT. Now we need to shift gears and talk about the heart. Because it's easy to be like, well, change your behavior, change. Really, let's look at, Jesus says it's out of the overflow of the mouth, the heart speaks. He talks about the heart. 729 times the heart is mentioned in the Bible in the ESV version, and it is never about the blood pumping organ in your chest. Never. So there's something, it's what really the definition, cardia is the word for heart. It's our decision maker, or it's the desire producer that makes us tick. So it's not your emotions, like I love you, it's your decision maker. And so God cares about our hearts. I talked about this when I shared my story, and I talked about that one thing that we can do to advocate for God's design for marriage. And I mentioned this heart map, which I'm fully aware we'll probably get to heaven and God will be like, so that heart map you created, super cute. Nice try. But this is just our rough way of trying to articulate something that's so ambiguous. But just to review this heart map, I'm actually going to use it. I could use my story, but I'm actually going to share my husband's story. So he was born with core needs as well, which we talk about those as like good needs God put in us before the fall for things like affirmation or purpose or to be desired. We see this need for purpose in creation when he gives us jobs. Or this need to be seen. It says in Ephesians that before he made the world, he knew us and chose us as his own. This need to be desired. So my husband, his primary core need is this need to be desired. And just as he is. Like just that he can side by side. I always call it like broing it up, which is definitely a gender stereotype. But what I mean by that is just like, hey dude, sports and the Star Wars. And I used to shake my head at it a lot until I was like, okay, help me understand the why. And he said, I feel like I can just be. Like when I'm with other guys, when I feel like I don't have to like say something profound or come up with these grand ideas, but just be myself. He's like, I feel so seen and wanted as I am. As a kid though, he was born into, his mom was very sick growing up. She was on a feeding tube until she was 16. And when she got pregnant with Matt's older brother, there was a lot of risk. And then when she got pregnant with Matt 13 months later, they really encouraged them to abort him because she was so high risk. But she said, no, I am going to keep my son no matter what. This was 1984. And so there was not the equipment, the help, the neonatal care or the mother care that there is now. And so she gave birth and she was on bed rest for a while. They were both in the hospital for a couple months, and they said at best he would be brain damaged, like mentally disabled, and at worst they would both die. Matt is way smarter than I am. He got a great score on his ACT, SAT, and he didn't even try. But when he was 3, he heard the story of his birth and how doctors encouraged them to abort him. And so his parents were trying to say, oh my goodness, we chose you, we desired you. But Matt interpreted it as, doctors are smart. They didn't think I should be alive. I shouldn't be alive. I'm worthless. Which his parents didn't know that. They didn't know how to cover for that. But he grew up with this lie in his heart that I'm not worth anything. I'm not specially chosen as my own, or for me. And so, Corny's inborn sin, he starts to interpret this. And as a kid, he did as what most kids do to try and get his worth. He did sports, he did, good grades. He had like a 4.5 or something. But it wasn't enough, as the things of this world are never enough. And he got to a point in middle school where he was going to kill himself one day. And a song came on the radio by Blink 182. God bless them. But it was, I think, Adam's song. And they usually on the radio don't play the last chorus or the last stanza. I don't know, music words. The last part of it. But the last part said, they did that day. That day he was going to kill himself. And it said, tomorrow holds such better days. And Matt thought, I want it tomorrow. I actually do want it tomorrow. And so he put his plans on hold. Nobody knew. And God, in his provision and his wisdom, he actually had youth pastors, and we've got some youth pastors in here, reach out to him and start calling him up and including them. They didn't know his story. He didn't share it until years later, but started showing them really God's loving and choosing him. But Matt also, in that same season, it wasn't really happily ever after. One secret way that he held on to where he felt desired was in pornography that he got introduced to at a young age, where he felt like these anonymous pictures on a screen. There's always a heart behind it. The issue's never the issue. And so these pictures, it felt like he could be himself, that they wanted him, they loved him. It's weird to say these words out loud, isn't it? When you actually put language to something. But that's what he felt inside, and he wrestled through, and it wasn't until our marriage, 6 years in, when he finally broke free, when he came forward to me. But you can hear in that he had these good needs, born broken sin. He had these experiences where it's like, oh, this, these good grades will kind of meet it, or this pornography will kind of meet it to a point, and then you start believing these lies, well, I'm worthless, this is the only place I can go, that feels bad. You keep going back to the behaviors. And so when Matt finally came forward to me, it wasn't that I was his savior, but I did represent Jesus, who loves him in his mess and chooses him no matter what in his mess. And that really started to break free some layers in his heart to surrender himself to Christ. So the same is true for me. I have my own version of broken sexuality. You all in this room, and I would encourage you to start using that language. What is your version of broken sexuality that you need to choose, that you need to surrender to the Lordship of Christ? I cannot wait until the day, I pray I see it, when a kid could come into, I'm pointing at you as a youth pastor, a kid could come to you in junior high who's wrestling with same-sex attractions or his gender identity, which that's another piece. Let's say start with same-sex attractions. He's wrestling with that. And he can say, oh, I'm really wrestling with this. And you can speak no shame to him, because you're going to be like, oh, thank you for sharing that. Man, that's your version of broken sexuality. How can we come alongside you? We've got our own. Where it's almost boring. That it's a boring conversation when someone comes out to you. I cannot wait for that day where people do not look at Matt and I and we ask the question, if Matt and I are looking at the same woman lustfully, who is sinning more? I cannot wait until people don't do why is it me? Yeah. Lust is lust. So this is the biggest thing that we need to think about, is that it always goes back to the heart, and you can always find good needs even behind the sin. We often are stopping at, well, just porn blockers, don't do it, don't. Why not ask questions of what we're looking at and understand the why behind it, so that we can help to remove barriers between the need meter and the needs of our souls. The third thing that we need to do in order, so we have this cultural assessment, we understand there's this heart stuff going on. The third step that we need to take is to understand and know what we believe and why we believe it. This is important because honestly, people who are side A or affirming, they've done their research. A lot of them have. And so we can get into these theological battles and we actually don't know how to spar with them. Now, I'm saying battles, but what I mean by that is, let's say someone just asks you a point blank question. Okay, isn't Romans 1, isn't that about pederasty, where slaves were having sex with their or masters were having sex with their slaves? Do you know how to answer that? I just got asked that on an email this week. And so I would encourage you, I'm going to offer some resources at the end here. People to Be Loved by Preston Sprinkle's really great. Centerforfaith.com is really great. Again, I'll offer these at the end. As far as like, he has one pastoral paper there that's 15 reasons for the affirming view and 15 responses. You'll hear this a lot, is that people don't get saved often by arguments. It's true. However, we do need to always be ready for a reason for why we believe what we believe. Mm-hmm. And if people can go, well, here's the question, you're like, I don't have an answer, we need to be able to. Mm-hmm. I did mention this though before. These are my 2 favorite reasons for God's design for marriage. I'm just going to quickly go through them. But the biggest one is if you look at Matthew 19, when Jesus refers to marriage, which there really is no word for marriage in the Bible other than a one flesh union. And he says, the two will become one flesh. Which two is it in Matthew 19? It's not 2 people that love each other. It's not 2 people that are attracted to each other, or 3 or 4 or 5. Mm-hmm. I have no doubt they love each other. I have no doubt you're attracted to each other. But that's not the question. The question is, what is marriage? And according to the Bible, the 2 who are to become one flesh is male and female. So this one for me is a quick go-to. There's a bunch of other arguments, including that Romans 1:1 in People to Be Loved or at centerforfaith.com. Again, this is my favorite one, is why though male and female? We just seem to spar, we seem to hate each other, we just seem to like it's so annoyingly pushing on each other. But the reason is on purpose, is that the difference is supposed to model difference between divinity and humanity. In this, let's go to that Ephesians 5, divinity and humanity, that God, who is so different from us, if male and female are so different, how different is divinity from humanity? And yet God wants to marry us. Our differences are not a cosmic joke, they're cosmic design. And so I really think that to celebrate this, we need to start doing that again. We get to work our language. And yes, I mean, if everyone's laughing, it's true. Men can do things, women can do things, totally makes fun, can be fine. But when there's this bitter edge to our joking that is somewhat rooted, we got to watch that. And then 2, as single people, if you hear us married people doing the eye roll, will you call us out, pretty please? Because we are a gospel metaphor at the grocery store, in our neighborhoods and in our homes, of God's love for us. We just aren't always great at that. All right, step 4 that we can take is to speak the language. Now, some people, when they hear LGBTQIA, they're like, so PC. It's the homosexuals. But to use the phrase homosexuals, honestly, it's just such an archaic term. It's also not true. My friend Ben, he's sexually attracted to his wife, but he wrestles with his gender identity. Is he a homosexual? No, he could fall under the transgender umbrella. That's not the same as being attracted to the same sex. So we want to use the language so that we're using the proper language. Additionally, even if we put that argument aside, if you want to love your LGBT friends well, we need to use the language because we want to be missional. And I say this tenderly, and I say the word missional tenderly because, nobody wants to feel like a project, ever. But I will say this to you all, if you were called to another country to be a missionary and they spoke a language different from you, wouldn't you want to learn it? You don't just jump off the plane and be like, y'all should know Jesus. And then they don't. And then you're like, well, I did my job. No, we need to speak the language of the day, because to be honest with you, if you think about that heart map, behaviors, language is a behavior level thing. So even if you're like, oh, you shouldn't call yourself that, can we use that language to get to the heart? So you all may already know these things, but just what do the letters stand for? LGBTQIA, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, plus. So these are the different words. I just don't often say the plus because it sounds weird, but you can say LGBT, LGBTQIA. There are, I think, like 174 different genders that you can identify as in Canada, which is a lot. And it's easy to be like, what? But for these people who find that letter, it is like finding a diagnosis. It's like you've been trying to articulate your experience your whole life, and then all of a sudden you find it. And then you say the word and it feels freeing. So for us to just diminish or roll our eyes at, which I know it's hard, but it's not as hard as dying on a cross. So are we willing to use their language in order to speak at the heart level? I'm willing. Here's some words to avoid. I already mentioned this one: homosexuals, transsexuals. So I don't hear this one as much, maybe from some in the older generation sometimes, but use the term transgender, generally speaking. If someone wrestles with their biological sex, it's an umbrella term. Love the sinner, hate the sin. So this isn't completely untrue of a statement. However, it's only been used as a grenade to lob at the LGBT community. I prefer love the sinner, love everyone, and hate your own darn sin. So can we do that and just eliminate that? Gay lifestyle. What is a gay lifestyle? What's a straight lifestyle? Is it Kim Kardashian? Is it Christian Amish romance novels? It's just a stereotype. So just if you mean to say like, oh, she is out or she identifies as this, just say that. Just if you say gay life, it's just a gender stereotype. Gay agenda. So I'm in some Facebook groups, like subgroups of like people who are like me, who are wrestle with their sexuality at some level, yet are surrendering to Jesus. And sometimes they post memes about you all. When you talk about the gay agenda, I'll tell you one just so you are a little more woke. There's this gay agenda with maybe a rainbow on it. So it's like, here's my gay agenda for the day. Wake up, drink coffee, go to work, come home, go to bed. So we are not like Pinky in the Brain, where it's like, what do you want to do today, Pinky? Try and take over the world. That is not most LGBT people. There are LGBT activists. There's also straight ally activists. So I would encourage using that term, and instead of like rolling your eyes at, the gay agenda, it's not likely your friend or your daughter who's wrestling with it. So I would avoid that. Gay marriage with air quotes. You can believe that it's not God's design for marriage without using snarky air quotes. And I don't even think everyone means to make it snarky. I think they're really like, well, it's not marriage. And we just went through that, in Matthew 19. It's not marriage. But when same-sex couples choose to get married, they aren't like waking up and being like, oh my gosh, let's just get married. Let's just do it. Let's just, on a whim. There's usually a high cost. There's, it's hard. There's a lot of cost when they choose to get married. And so for us to be like, you and your marriage, are they ever gonna open up the door of their heart to you? To talk about maybe even issues they're having in their marriage? No. So I just encourage, you can believe it's not God's design for marriage without using air quotes. Now, I'm gonna pause a second. I usually at some point in this part, I talk about shame. If when I'm going through this list, you guys are reading it and you're like, dude, I literally just tweeted that and that and that and that. That was like my tweet just now. I just encourage you, it's okay. Just go, oops. Don't dive into shame and self-hatred and then hate me and hate yourself. Just go, oops. And if you need to delete something, great. If you need to go back to someone and be like, oh, I'm so sorry, do that. So I would just, let's not get stuck in shame. Let's just, okay, now I know, let's move forward. Pronouns. I would encourage using the pronoun one of your transgender friends would like you to use. Now, kids are a whole different ballgame. When you've got 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds wanting to transition, that's a whole other conversation. If you guys want to talk about it, we can talk about that. But like even teenagers and up, in like which age, at least 18 and up, if they're like, hey, this is my preferred pronoun. An example that I'd love to share with you is my friend Kat. When I first met her, she preferred they or cat. And, there was a glimmer of a piece of me that was like, no, you're born female and you're supposed to be female. That was like, no, can I say she, her? And I was like, you will speak her language in order to get heart to heart. And I asked her, Kat, when I met her, she was barely starting to think about following Jesus. She was going to propose to her girlfriend and she was going to transition to male. And she reached out to me, Laurie, I want to know what God says about sexuality and gender. Will you meet with me? She's just curious. And I asked her maybe 6 months, a year into our walking alongside relationship, which now she literally speaks on stages with me about God's design for marriage. She's single. She's just surrendered her gender and sexuality. And she now, 2.5 years in, is just starting to be okay more with she, her. 2.5 years, guys. I said, Kat, 6 months, a year in, if I had been like super like, no, you are she, her, she, would you have ever have even met with me again? She just started laughing. Of course not. So there would have been a missed gospel heart-to-heart conversation if I had gotten stuck on pronouns. So this is not me speaking on behalf of the Holy Spirit. I'm not even speaking on behalf of your church. I'm just saying this is my advice to you. If you want to get below the behavior level to the heart needs, use the language of the day. Us versus them. You never know who is in the room. When we do this eye-rolling, or you're watching Netflix with your kids, you don't know what your kids are going to wrestle with when they grow up. And so when a same-sex character comes on or someone is wrestling their gender, your kids are storing that. Your friends are storing that, and they're thinking, okay, you're not safe. You're not safe. So we have to, not only is the Holy Spirit in the room, but you never know who's in the room wrestling with what, and we want to be safe. Now, someone may come to you and say sometime, I'm gay. What does that mean? You don't know until you ask more questions. They could say, I'm gay, and what they mean by that is, this is my experience. It's like glasses that they put on sometimes, but they're like maybe Gorilla glued to their hand, and it's not going anywhere. It's part of their life. I got these glasses. But that's all they're saying. I know nothing about their beliefs about marriage. I just know their sexual attractions. Okay. Or they could say, I'm gay and I am this person. It's the glasses that I wear, and this is how I see the world. It affects everything I do. What that exactly means, it's different for each person. But when they say it, it still says nothing about their theology. I still don't know if they're open to same-sex relationships. All I know is they're attracted to the same sex, and that's how they see the world. But they may say, I'm gay and I'm open to a same-sex relationship. Now I'm hearing theology. So they might just say that. So when someone says, hey, I'm gay, thanks so much for sharing that with me. Can you help me understand? What do you mean by that? That's not an invasive question, by the way. That's just a curious question. However, they may say, I'm gay and I hold to an affirming worldview, that God allows or affirms same-sex sexual relationships. Now I'm hearing theology. Y'all straight people, I'm not assuming everyone is here, but if you are straight, you can hold to the affirming worldview. So I'm straight and I hold to the affirming worldview. That says nothing about your sexual orientation. It says something about your theology. Or I am gay or straight and I hold to the historically Christian, Orthodox, or non-affirming. These are all interchangeable, whatever you want to use. I just don't love non-affirming because it just sounds so frown-facey. I don't love that. But God does not allow or affirm same-sex sexual relationships. So this is theology. The other one is your sexual attractions. Make sense?
Yeah.
Step 5, earn relational currency. Okay, so we know the context. All right, we understand that we're broken. We're understanding the heart context here. We got the language. I'm going to be missional here. So now people get this sort of question, which is fine. You guys can answer this. But how they say it is they're like, okay, when do I get to say what's true? And they're holding the truth like a grenade. They're like, can I say it now? And I'm like, you got to check yourself before you wreck yourself. Do people still say that? I don't think they say that anymore, but I just did. All right. This is just a review from my last talk, sermon, whatever. The number one thing you guys can do is to live out your metaphor, your marriage metaphor well. Single people, show us eternity well. Joyfully live into your marriage metaphor. Married people, show us God's pursuit, that oneness pursuit of us. So no matter what, if you forget everything I say, show us, not so that they hunger for your Hallmark marriage, but they hunger for Him. Here's something else before you say anything. Internally process, how do you actually feel about LGBT people? I have some people who come to me and they're so hopping mad. And sometimes I start diving into their story and a same-sex cousin assaulted them who wasn't even gay when they were 16. And they're actually mad, rightly so, at their 16-year-old that assault they never processed, but somehow they hate everyone who's attracted to the same sex. Now, I'm not saying that LGBT people are pedophiles. That person, even who hurt them, was straight. But they just assume anyone of the same gender, anything sexual, it's like their brains just overwhelm and they throw a nice coat of anger over all of it. Mm-hmm. So they're actually could be okay with having a nuanced conversation, but they haven't dealt with when they were 16 yet. Or I've had it where there's parents who come in and their 16-year-old daughter comes out and the mom is so hopping mad. And I had this happen to me once where the Holy Spirit just dropped this question in my mind and I just asked, it felt random, but I said, how are you doing with your husband's pornography addiction? And she goes, bad. She was actually mad at her husband and hadn't done a lick of forgiveness. They haven't worked on anything. And so now their kid has sexual brokenness. So it's like, I can't control him. I can't control this. And so it's like sexual brokenness, rage. Or, I actually want to engage people's hearts. I want to love people with grace and truth. So just get to the bottom of this. And really process, do you have unforgiveness? Is there something in your past or present that you need to process? Pray. Ask the Lord to bring people into your life or become aware of who's in your life who identify as LGBT. God, can you entrust me with some people who can engage with me in this? Ask the Lord to make your heart ready to receive them. I've had people say, be ready for when your kids come out. If they do, practice your not surprised face. That's a load of bull, to be honest with you. I just don't think is okay advice to practice words, but eyes are the window to your soul. So if your heart has not done this forgiveness work, this heart work, that you really, really believe that the ground is level at the foot of the cross and that there's these good heart needs driving all of us just to different brokenness, y'all aren't ready for this. So this is a highly rejected people group. And so for us to be like grenades of truth bombs, no, I ain't going to put you within 100 feet of an LGBT person. We got to get our hearts ready and malleable. Watch your words. Again, we haven't even gotten to truth yet. What do you say when a gay character comes on TV? Do you say the same response when a heterosexual sleeps together in a chick flick? Same reaction? Or do we just need to be, okay, wow, we need to have conversations about sexual brokenness in general? And if it's just a gay person, that's not even like showing same-sex love, but it's just like, your kid may come out with attraction to the same sex. Does every bit about them have to be an eye roll or scoff? No. Doesn't even need to be a sin conversation. It's, oh man, that's his version of broken sexuality. Let's bring that language into our churches. Do you say when you get married, or is it if God calls you to marriage? This one we say so much in our home. So much so that our kids roll their eyes at us. So our oldest daughter is like very much in love with many characters. But I say, oh, Gwen, dear one, I say, if God calls you, and she interrupts me, I know, if God calls me to marriage. But But that's what I want her to know, that her happily ever after, which if you talk to married people, it's not a happily ever after. It's supposed to reflect the actual happily ever after. But so do single people and how they show us God's enoughness. So I want them to be bored and annoyed with me about how much I value singleness and marriage equally. Are we saying this? Again, if we haven't, we've been saying this, when you get married, you can apologize. We can go back, even if they're grown-up kids. Which brings us to apologize. If you know that there's things that I'm saying today, you can go back. It's never too late to apologize, as I've heard in a song. It isn't ever too late. We think that it is. Oh, it was 20 years ago. I mean, if you guys think about 20 years ago when someone hurt you, and maybe you've processed that forgiveness, if that person came back and said sorry, it would still mean something. So it's not going to dig up old wounds. Just if the Spirit's prompting, do it. Also on this one, I have met with LGBT people who I just am meeting for the first time, and they'll tell me stories of, pastors who are great, but sometimes pastors or parents or leaders who, they come forward and they are escorted out the door. I apologize as if I did it. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. That was sin. To call sin is not to affirm same-sex marriage. So they may even be in a same-sex relationship, and I'm calling the pastor out on sin. That's still sin. I'm not affirming same-sex marriage if I'm apologizing for a pastor or parent or ministry leader's sin. We need to stop being so anxious about this. Just apologize. Again, this would probably be the second thing. In addition to working on your marriage metaphors, this would be my second if you forget everything else I say. Humility is key. If you approach an LGBT person, you're like, what did they call? Oh my gosh, I called them a homosexual transsexual. And they're a bisexual. I don't know what I'm doing. And your foot is straight in your mouth. Pause it. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I don't know. Will you help me? That's not affirming same-sex marriage. That's just being humble. If they don't see it as sin, wait to call it sin. So I'll hear this sometimes with people, let's say, someone who is affirming they're in a same-sex relationship, they literally don't see anything wrong with it. And you, who are just kind of getting to know them, and you're like, well, I have my sin, which I want to use that in the church, but this is someone who's not in the church or is out there, doesn't even see it as sin. You're like, well, I struggle with gossiping, and you struggle with same-sex marriage. No, they're going to shut you right down. So you can believe it's sin without trying to earn the relational currency in that way. Just wait on it. Just wait. I'm not saying it's never appropriate. I'm just saying when it's that sort of a chasm, wait on it. Watch others' words. Call people out on their othering with gentleness and ideally in person. The internet's the worst. So, if you see people, they, them, homosexuals, blah, 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 blah. I don't know. You could you can throw me under any bus you want. You'd be like, I just saw this weirdo chick, lady, whatever, watch this. You could say this might help. But say here's some nuanced way we can say this. Because you could say something like, you never know who's in the room. Or, hey, I know someone who wrestled with this and really felt shame in here. So gently call others out. We're not great at that in the church. We either scream, usually on the internet, but face-to-face, loving, calling each other out is gigantic and really critical. Ask questions. These are some of my go-tos. I meet an LGBT person. Hey, thank you, so nice to meet you. Thank you for sharing your story. Hey, it's okay if you don't want to answer any of my questions. So get the get out of jail free card. But I'd love to hear more about your story. Love to hear more about your journey. Hey, I'd love to hear how your faith interacts with your sexuality. 86% of LGBT people have come from a church background. 86%. And so we need to know, okay, that's okay to have this connection. But build a bridge. Let's say you guys are just at odds. And you use any sentence you say, maybe they're interpreting it wrong. Or any sentence they say, you're interpreting it wrong. let's talk Star Wars. Let's talk water. I don't know. Find somewhere that you can build a bridge and go there. Even, same-sex couple with kids. Talk about their kids. You're not affirming same-sex marriage to talk about their kids. I worked for a few years with at-risk youth in a gang situation. A lot of them were involved in gangs at some level. 15-year-old girls pregnant. Was I like, ooh, your boyfriend is that gang leader, so I'm like not gonna talk to you? No, I was a normal person. I asked him about their boyfriend. I asked him about their baby. I gave them presents for their baby. So it's okay to be a normal person and ask normal person questions. You're not affirming same-sex marriage. Listen. So simply asking and listening to stories. Do you know what listening does? This was a Harvard study. When people were listened to well, those speaking felt less anxious, more self-aware, and reported higher clarity about their attitudes about the topics presented. So we're doing lots of yelling at each other these days. When you simply just listen, those who are being listened to, less anxious, more self-aware, higher clarity. Additionally, they also felt their attitude was more complex and less extreme. Bing, bing, bing. In other words, their perspective was not one-sided. That's what we want. We want to be able to hear and listen to each other. So if we just listen, you might just sense the anxiety and the tension in the relationship. Even if you're talking about theology and arguing at that level, just hearing their side may take it down a notch. Which I'll just throw in a story real quick about the power of listening. My husband and I and our ministry team, we put on an event and we heard it was going to get protested by people who hold to the affirming worldview. And so I wanted to meet with them beforehand and ask them why they were protesting us, because literally we were doing this in a very gracious format. And so I met with two of the leaders. I bought them coffee. I heard their story. And do you know what I heard? It was so interesting to me, is that one of the two leaders, she was a female, leaders of the protest, I said, so why are you doing this? Why are you protesting our event? I'm trying to make the world safer for you. Yeah, we disagree theologically, but I'm trying to make this better. And she said, there was a time when I was coming to realization of my sexuality, that there was an event happening in my world. There's a bunch of pastors coming, trying to learn how to engage this conversation. And one of those pastors came to me and said, hey, I want to hear your story. And she said, okay. And he came, and to his credit, he found her after, and he said, hey, I want to hear your story. And she said she could tell the second his ears turned off, and he waited for her to stop talking so he could share his truth. Now, in his defense, listening's hard, and she was probably very sensitive to it. But in her defense, have you guys ever experienced that? Mm-hmm. Where you're saying something, you can just tell they're just waiting for you to just be quiet so they could say their side. So don't just listen so that you can throw your truth bomb. She said, do you know what she said? Because she was not listened to well. She said, I made a vow in that moment that I will never have someone come into my circle with your theology ever again. Mm. And she did lots of slandering of me, and they led this protest. However, I heard her in that moment, and I apologized. I said, I'm so sorry. When she talked about this pastor, and they talked about different woundings, there was a time when she had literal tears in her eyes. And I walked away, and like I said, I did get protested again. But the next day, those two people met with another friend of mine, and they said to them, man, that Laurie girl, she's either super intense or full of the Holy Spirit. Which I'm probably both. I hope I'm both. But for them, they noticed something that drew them to not me, but to God in me, just by simply listening. And again, they still protest, and there may be definite differences between us, but I think their listening has more power than we realize. If in doubt, switch it out. Now, this is not something you're going to tell someone. Now, let me explain why. So let's say you're talking with someone, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm gay, here's my partner. And your prefrontal cortex is flooding with anxiety hormones that all you can think about is gay sex, and you're freaking out. Mm-hmm. A way you can chill out and be a normal person is to go, okay, what if they were sleeping with someone of the opposite sex? Now you're fine, right? So if in doubt, if you literally cannot fathom or process this, just switch it out to something that you can more easily process. Now, don't say that you're doing that if you're doing that in your head. I'm just giving you a tip so you can have a normal conversation, because sin is sin. But I recognize that this version of brokenness has been elevated for so long, and so we do go to this heightened anxiety place. So to help us with that, just, okay, I'm okay. Translate words into core needs. So I find it so fascinating that if you really start listening to people's stories and really start listening, especially to suffering and places of desire, people start self-diagnosing exactly where and how they need God. So, same-sex couple. Oh, I'm so devastated. I didn't get into this doctoral program I applied for. I've been working really hard for it. But I'm really grateful that my girlfriend's been there for me. She's been such a rock. I hear a need for safety. Girlfriend's there. I hear a need for purpose. I've been trying so hard for this thing. Boom, boom, boom. Do I think the doctoral program will ever give her enough to scratch the purpose need enough? No. Will her girlfriend ever be safe enough to scratch that itch in her heart? No. But she just told me exactly how and where she needs God. I might not say it, I'm not going to say that in that moment, but I'm going to lodge that away for, okay, I'm not going to shame your girlfriend. I'm going to shame your failure. I'm going to say, I'm so sorry for your pain. I'm so glad that she's been there for you. And I'm going to start this journey of connecting her heart to God, just like I need my heart connected to God. Mm-hmm. What do they need? A home, a meal, a family? Meet practical needs. Ask the Lord, how can I really love LGBT people? He'll show you really practical ways to serve as you would any missional community. Step 6, so this is our last one, which really you can tell these are ongoing, but when do we spend that relational currency? So when and how do we speak the truth in love? Well, we really want to keep in mind the primary goal is not to make people straight, is to not change behaviors. You know, that's making people into little Pharisees as opposed to little Christs. So sure, maybe they'll break off with their girlfriend, but their heart is still lost and wandering, as we all can relate to that. And so know that our primary goal is to connect hearts to the heart of the Father. But when do we say truth? When do we have these sort of conversations? So some of it might be, someone you recently met and they're like, oh, you're a Christian. Well, what's your perspective on LGBT? And you may say it and, oh, well, what do you think about, pederasty from Romans 1? And you may talk about it then in gentleness, humility, kindness. But when do you actually, call someone out on their same-sex relationship? This is a super cheesy phrase, but whatever, we're this deep, let's keep going. When your heart close. If you are married, if you have roommates, if you have close friends, when do you want them to call out areas in your life of sin? I mean, you didn't have a good time relating in the morning, and he says something at 5 p.m. that night, and you're like, oh, heck no. I don't even know you now. You need to have that heart closeness. So just think about it. When do you want people to say things about your life? On the internet, when you just met, fresh new small group? No. You need to be heart close. Or perhaps you're in an asked for mentoring relationship. So that was Kat and I. So where she was like, hey, I want to know more. And I was like, okay, I'm going to journey alongside you. Or you're in a position of spiritual influence and family. So parents, your church community. So Paul does talk about this. I am not about to solve church discipline. I know it has been done so wrongly in the past, but I will say this, is that the reason for church discipline, where Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 6, you need to expel the believer from among you who is wrestling with issues of sexual sin. It wasn't like excommunication and now you're the worst. The church was such family. There was such warmth there. And so to be expelled from the community, he'd feel the cold. But the intent was always bringing back. So it's not like we've done, at least my experience with church discipline has been so like hard-nosed and bad, you're shaming you, expel the unbeliever. But it really is like, we want you here, but we can't have this little bit of yeast that infects the whole dough. So I cannot solve all of this, but we do need to be thinking about this more. And how do we not only do church discipline, but how do we become community so intimate so that if someone was to miss a week, that it's not even a week, it's that you're out of the system, you're out of the community, and they feel the cold and they miss it and they want to come back. So there's bigger picture issues that we need to be thinking about, is what is church and how do we engage church discipline? All right, but how do we do this? How do we call people out on things? I remember, again, my friend Kat, she was going to marry her girlfriend, wrestling with her gender, and she's given me permission to share these stories, so that's why I keep bringing her up. But I remember one poignant moment with her. We were sitting in Panera, when you could still sit in Panera, and she said, "Oh, Laurie, if only I could marry my girlfriend. If only I could transition to male." And I said, "Kat, you know what? I don't know everything about gender, but I do know anytime I hear the phrase, if only, the words that are coming after that are an idol. Because the only, if only is the one and only. So it doesn't matter what she said, if only, once I have, at least I have, if only I have this." So that's a way that's not as like same-sex, gender, bop, 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 bop. But to just call out gently your brother or sister as they're wrestling with things. Hey, that's an idol. Additionally, how else do you do it? Surrender to God's order of operations. You know what Matt had to learn before he could come forward with his wrestling with pornography addiction, heterosexual pornography addiction? He went to see a counselor who was more like a prophet. And he was so scared she was going to see into his life and call him out on stuff. I still was super in the dark. I didn't know what was going on, but he goes and sees her and he has this experience with God. And do you know what God showed Matt? He showed Matt little Matt in this vision that he gave him, where he had this big backpack of burdens. And he walked up to this tree where Jesus was, and Jesus said, "Give me those burdens." And he set them down. And Jesus looked in his eyes and said, "Know that I love you." He didn't say, "You're addicted to pornography, you weirdo, you terrible human." He said, "Know that I love you." Ephesians 3 talks about the height, the breadth, the depth of God. And he says, "I pray that you know this love that was so great you cannot even fully comprehend it. But when you do, then you will be filled with the fullness of life and power that comes from God." Love empowers us to die to ourselves. But y'all don't know God's order of operations. God might be wanting to deal with shame in their life and their father wound and their love. And then sexuality is 25th on God's list. So if you're really committed to walking with someone, be sensitive to the Spirit. Be sensitive to where God's already moving. He's already moving in their lives. Look for areas of suffering and desire and move in there. Another way, how do we help them? How do we speak this truth? It may be in this, you're noticing none of it's very head on. None of it's very I'm going to convict them with theology. Even for me with my story, theology helped to be the crowbar when I was wrestling with our marriage to get me out of it. But it was these sort of disciplines that's being heard, and including lament. My friend Ben, in walking with him, He's wrestling with that tension of wanting to transition because he feels like his gender identity and his sexual identity, like that or his sexual biology don't match. I could say to him, well, I just don't think that it's God's best for you to transition, so just don't. Okay. How far does that get us? No, I go, that stinks. And I know that at least half of the Psalms are Psalms of lament where David is saying, this world is broken. Jesus did that at Lazarus' tomb. Why did he weep and gnash his teeth at Lazarus' tomb? It wasn't because he was just, I don't know, we say Jesus wept, but he wept and gnashed his teeth. The real translation is like he snorted like a bull. Why? I think because it's when he saw death, Lazarus' death, he knew what he was going to do, but he thought, this is not the way it's supposed to be. We can sit with our friends in their sexual and gender brokenness, and we can go to God with them and say, we know this is not the way it's supposed to be. Isn't that sometimes enough? Someone with you in your mess to grieve with you. You don't have to fix it. You don't even have to have all the answers. You're solid on God's design. But you're with them in the messy grief. This is the last note, which I know there's more nuances, but this is really important. Remember, whoever you're walking with, that they're not your disciples. They are fellow future or current kingdom warriors alongside you. No one likes to be a project. No one. And so when you are seeing your LGBT friends who are broken, when I see people who literally are asking me to mentor them, so I could literally say, you are my disciples. No, I see them as, no, we are in this battle for hearts to be one with God together. And so I want you to throw off every sin that hinders, not because God's a fun Nazi, but because I want you next to me to go and take back the kingdom for Jesus. So if you call your broken, fellow equally broken brothers and sisters into that, it's going to speak to their soul. It's going to speak to that God-given purpose, that beautiful core need. So I'm going to offer you now, these are some of my favorite resources. So our podcast, the Hole in My Heart podcast, I really do love it. It's good stuff. I have a Journey Well book that I wrote. I actually ended up self-publishing it for a few different reasons, but it takes my discipleship journey with Carolyn, who was that woman who came alongside me, and I walk you through it. So if you are in a mentoring relationship with someone, or someone who's like, hey, I would like to study this more, even if you're not gay, if you are broken, you can do this, which is the point. Do it next to them. You can do it in a small group as well. Preston Sprinkle's People to Be Loved, centerforfaith.com, leadthemhome.org. Again, I'm guessing these will be posted. Equipyourcommunity.org, and Greg Cole's Single Gay Christian. It's just a beautiful story just of surrender, just from one of my single friends. So these are my favorite resources. Thank you guys so much for coming and listening, and I'm looking forward to some Q&A time together.